lets you know that today we're going to once again take a glimpse into the Twilight Zone to prompt us to consider some lessons for life. The episode that I've chosen for today is entitled The Obsolete Man. It's number 65 in the television series, primarily written and produced by Unitarian Rod Serling. It stars Burgess Meredith as Romney Wordsworth, the librarian, and Fritz Weaver as the Chancellor. Now, the clip you are about to see features the first part of the episode, and it includes an unusual on-screen appearance by Rod Serling as he introduces it. He usually saves his on-screen appearances for the end of the episodes, but he actually comes on in the beginning of this one too. Then we'll see the trial of Romney Wordsworth and his attempts at a defense, followed by Serling's narration at the end of the program. And I'll fill you in on what happened in between the moments of the first part of the clip and the end of that at the end of this clip. So, enter with me now into the Twilight Zone.
Wordsworth, Romney, obsolescence.
You walk into this room at your own risk, because it leads to the future. Not a future that will be, but one that might be. This is not a new world. It is simply an extension of what began in the old one. It has patterned itself after every dictator who has ever planted the ripping imprint of a boot on the pages of history since the beginning of time. It has refinements, technological advances, and a more sophisticated approach to the destruction of human freedom. But like every one of the super-states that preceded it, it has one iron rule. Logic is an enemy and truth is a menace. This is Mr. Romney Wordsworth in his last 48 hours on Earth. He's a citizen of the state, but will soon have to be eliminated because he is built out of flesh and because he has a mind.
You've been under investigation, Mr. Wordsworth, for the mandatory period of 1 year and 11 months. You're found to be obsolete. The purpose of this hearing is to make a finding in the matter and make a sentence accordingly. Do you understand that, Mr. Wordsworth? Your occupation, Mr. Wordsworth?
A librarian, sir.
A librarian. Having to do with books.
Yes, sir. Books.
Since there are no more books, Mr. Wordsworth, there are no more libraries. The field investigators in your sector have classified you as obsolete. Your rights are as follows, Mr. Wordsworth. You are to be liquidated within a period of 48 hours. You are obsolete, Mr. Wordsworth.
A lie. No man is obsolete.
You have no function, Mr. Wordsworth. You're an anachronism, like a ghost from another time.
I am nothing more than a reminder to you that you cannot destroy truth by burning pages.
You're a bug, Mr. Wordsworth, a crawling insect, an ugly, misformed little creature who has no purpose here, no meaning.
I am a human being.
Delusions, Mr. Wordsworth. Delusions that you inject into your veins with printer's ink. The narcotics that you call literature, poetry, essays of all kind, all of it an opiate. You have nothing but spindly limbs and a dream, and the state has no use for your kind.
I don't care. I tell you, I don't care. I'm a human being. I exist. And if I speak one thought aloud, that thought lives, even after I'm shoveled into my grave.
The Chancellor, the late Chancellor, was only partly correct. He was obsolete. But so is the state, the entity he worshipped. Any state, any entity, any ideology that fails to recognize the worth, the dignity, the rights of man, that state is obsolete.
Now, all of Serling's episodes have an unexpected twist. Wordsworth gets to choose his execution and the place for it. He chooses his own one-room apartment where he's saved a lot of books that he has on the shelves. Not supposed to have them, but he's got them. And his type of execution is going to be a bomb of the apartment at midnight. And he wants it to be televised nationally. Yes. He asks for the chancellor to come and see him before it's administered. And the chancellor, wanting to gloat once more, does come into the room for a visit. He shuts the door and enters into a conversation with Wordsworth, which again denigrates the librarian and lifts up the state. Eventually, he says he must go, but finds that Wordsworth has locked the door and he can't get out. Wordsworth calmly opens one of the books he's managed to preserve, an old Bible, and reads Psalms from it as he prepares for his own death. Eventually, the chancellor cannot take it any longer and pleads to be released in the name of God, which is a heresy, since in their society, religious belief has also been banned as obsolete. Romney Wordsworth unlocks the door for him and returns to await his death. The chancellor then comes before the court himself. Since he is now deposed in his shame, this was televised nationally, and the jurors rule that he too is obsolete, and they execute him themselves. Now, this episode prompts many possibilities for discussion and exploration. We could spend a whole series just of sermons on this episode, I think. So for today, though, I'm going to narrow my focus to censorship and perhaps how that relates to our value of freedom of speech. Reading is so important, isn't it? Reading is so important. I've often been asked how someone like myself could have been raised here in Bullitt County in the 50s and 60s by very conservative parents and never lived anywhere else except for brief periods of time of study. And yet, here I am, here in a Unitarian Universalist pulpit. As one of my classmates from Statesboro High class of 68 once asked me, "Jane, what in the world happened to you?" What in the world? And my response to her and others has been, I read. And I do believe that if you can read broadly and listen to many voices, you will become more empathetic with others and become a more critical thinker. And I hope a better person. Our examination of the history of humanity, when we look back, displays times in our world when that was more difficult than others. Times when many, many books were burned and banned. A lot was censored, and it still is in much of our world today. And Serling shares a possible future time when the totalitarian state declares that folks like Romney Wordsworth and me and you, who value reading, are deemed obsolete. I asked myself when deciding which episodes to use, though, if this episode itself wasn't obsolete. After all, we have the internet and the World Wide Web. And if anything, we may have too little censorship on those domains, or perhaps others. It seems that lies and untruths are constantly being put forward, and it's hard to know what to believe. Hard to know. I recently stood in a long line at Statesboro High School to sign out my grandson Thomas. He texted me and asked me to pick him up. He said there was a school shooting threat on the internet and he did not want to die. Well, especially with all he's been through with his dad and things, I said, "I'm coming to get you, Thomas." I wasn't the only one there. Now, we don't know if this was a serious threat or a hoax. But it's like someone yelling fire in a theater. You don't look for the smoke, you look for the exit when you hear it. But then I've also been reminded that censorship in various forms is alive and well, even here. And we have to be able to determine a balance of sorts. I read this headline recently in the Atlanta Journal. Did you see that? Abby Martin said she was asked to sign paperwork agreeing not to support a boycott of Israel before making a speech at Georgia Southern University, which was scheduled for this February 28, 2020. Were you aware that the state of Georgia passed a law that took effect in 2016 prohibiting contracts exceeding $1,000 with any companies or individuals that engage in a boycott of Israel?
I was asked to sign that when I took the job at Georgia Southern to do Godspell.
Yes. Right. Any contract, and I don't know how much they're paying you for that, but maybe it's on all the contracts they have now. And, regardless of your politics about and what you think about the boycott, can you imagine being able to, you can't work for us unless you sign this oath? Martin said she was supposed to be paid $1,000. Martin said that she was scheduled to be the keynote speaker at the 2020 International Critical Media Literacy Conference at the University of Savannah campus, which has now been called off. She said she was asked to sign the pledge last September as part of her compensation agreement, and she refused. My understanding is she's now suing the state of Georgia and Georgia Southern University. Plus, of course, at the same university that many of us associated with, this incident of this book burning took place last fall. Now, I had the book. What many of us did, but this probably actually ended up helping this author. What many of us did after we saw that, we said, I think I need to read that book, see what it's about. It's actually a good book, and if you want to borrow it, you may borrow it. But she had a very difficult time while she was here with our students. She said it actually reminded her of what her book was about with some of the things they said. And then they went afterwards and burned the book. And of course, we're told that they had the free speech right to do that. Although we all lean on the side of free speech, it's not always an easy thing. And there are pros and cons to censorship. So here are some that are identified in a Flow Psychology article. Some pros of censorship. First, it protects children from extremely violent and sexual material. The internet, mobile phones, and television have made it easier for kids to access all kinds of content, even those that can negatively influence them. And the television that's on the airways, of course, has been censored for some time. But now we have cable and we have Wi-Fi and all these other things. With media censorship, though, children can surf the web and watch TV with more freedom while being protected from pornographic and heavily violent material. So that's a pro, according to this article. 2, it limits advertisements that can be harmful. Some ads promote products that can be harmful to people's health, such as those that can influence body shaming, unhealthy eating habits, and addiction, like cigarettes, vaping, other things. It is understandable why these types of advertisements should be censored. And the article goes on to say another pro is it helps control hate. The media can censor information that is slandering certain religions, race, companies, or individuals. This is helpful in avoiding the development of prejudice or discrimination based on false information and propaganda. And fourth, the one we hear a lot, it helps protect security. There are instances when sharing sensitive information may do more harm than good, according to this article. By screening what is being reported and making sure it is published in a proper and timely manner, you can avoid panic and chaos. Well, They also list some cons. Oh, by the way, that last one about security and sensitive information, I watched a TED Talk with Edward Snowden. Now you may wonder how he did a TED Talk, but he was on a robot with his face streamed in, on the stage. And I've heard of the other side of that, which is very interesting as well. Here are the cons, though. The cons of media censorship. Number one, it encourages ignorance. Ignorance is a tool that can be used to control people and keep them unaware of what is really going on in their community. Censoring information about corruption and injustices mean people will continue to be victims of abuse and exploitation. Two, it promotes manipulation for personal gain. If the government is in charge of censoring media, politicians can use it to their advantage by allowing the publishing of information or advertisements only of companies, organizations, and other affiliations that support their political goals. Three, it limits education and awareness. War, poverty, terrorism, epidemics, and climate change are some of the most pressing issues society is faced with today. Sugarcoating or screening the information presented to the public could prevent people from knowing what is really going on in the world and hinder them from preparing or for addressing global issues. I know that the Chinese people felt that they didn't have enough information early on about the coronavirus for it to spread a lot. They were in the dark for sure, and in many cases still are for much of it. And four, it takes away freedom of speech. The First Amendment of the American Constitution protects the freedom of speech, and this freedom is what the U.S. is built upon. Limiting what can and cannot be said or published by the media is taking away this basic right. So the authors of this article see censorship as a double-edged sword and encourage us to be careful because it's sharp on both ends. What about that last concern of freedom of speech? Do we really have the freedom to say what we want to say? Or should we? Should we? Most of us would readily agree that we have freedom of thought. We pride ourselves as Unitarian Universalists as being free thinkers. But once the thought is spoken, as Romney Wordsworth said, it's given life. Or as the Bible said, the word becomes flesh, a life to it. It's no more just a thought. Maybe it's an action. And most would agree we do not have freedom of action, or perhaps it's somewhere in between. But it can certainly do harm. And where we see so much of that today is with the internet, where we encounter fake news and disinformation daily. Last year, our State Department published a report on this entitled Weapons of Mass Distraction. Weapons of Mass Distraction. Now, I'm not sure how many of those State Department employees have been fired now, but it was published last year, and this is what this says. Comes with this warning. The proliferation of social media platforms has democratized the dissemination and consumption of information, thereby eroding traditional media hierarchies and undercutting claims of authority. The environment, therefore, is ripe for exploitation by bad actors. Today, states and individuals can easily spread disinformation at lightning speed and with potentially serious impact. I think we are seeing a lot of that lately too. So what does the future hold? What does the future hold? Free the People is an internet-based organization which has a very libertarian standard about everything from literature to guns and more. They have this to say. They said, those who championed the internet in the early 90s hoped that it would be free from the corruption and oppression of the real world. And for a time it was. Everybody could get on it, you know, and you didn't have to worry about being censored. You could get the word out of things. New things are always unregulated until they're not. Legislation is always late and retroactive. In its early years, the internet had limited power. Now, I don't mean the earlier years when it was so controlled. I mean when it got out for the rest of us with the World Wide Web. Not least because it was only accessible by those who had the hardware and know how to use it. Those of you that were at Georgia Southern back in those days remember that we actually had to go through the University of Georgia system to use theirs. You know, we had to do something on ours, send it up, that kind of thing. But today, the combined information and connectivity of the web is potentially available to anyone with one of these, with a mobile phone, wherever they are. And this poses a problem in our globalized world as worldviews and political agendas collide. As Electronics Frontier Australia says, the internet is the victim of its own success. So we can expect more internet censorship, maybe, or can we expect less? At the international level, we are seeing a steady fracturing of the once imagined global village, which we had hoped for, a global village, into global factions, each with their own idea of what speech should be on the internet and what it should look like. And the possible rise in censorship of all kinds is not just at the state or big media level. It comes all the way down to the individual, who discovers that they are more and more often in a self-censoring mode, more and more often. I often ask myself things like this. Can I say this in this setting? Will I get in trouble like I did when I did that program of the Dance of the Seven Veils down in Brunswick? Almost got fired over that. Will this offend anyone? Can it be taken the wrong way? Does this seem a little too far to the left or a little too far to the right? Our desire for safety and security, and our desire to belong to certain groups governs our speech. It governs our speech. And to some degree, self-censorship could be a good thing. Could be a good thing. But when it stops us from telling the truth, then perhaps we have a problem. Perhaps we have a problem. Indeed, that is when censorship at any level is a problem. When truth is the victim of censorship, when truth is the victim of censorship, we all suffer. Everyone suffers. And then what? Will we have the courage? Will we have the courage to hold on to the truth as Romney Wordsworth did? Will we? Or is that only possible in the Twilight Zone? May this message today provoke some free thinking and free speech appropriately censored.